Happy Tuesday, everyone. We're going to give everybody a few minutes to come online. And this video we're going to save for our security page because a lot of people have been asking us around compliance and kind of best practices. So we'll try to hit on a couple of those. This will probably be a little bit shorter than some of our other webinars. So we really want to keep it focused and hopefully answer your questions as we go through. So we'll give it a few more minutes before we get started. Feel like, Jim, we should put some music on for this portion, right? It's like whenever a webinar is getting started, you're like, yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop the little screen share. And we'll go ahead and get started. So for those of you who aren't aware, the SEC not too long ago put out some new data breach rules, which had a lot of both of our customers and prospects reaching out to us. So we wanted to put this webinar together to kind of share what we've learned about it and kind of give you the resources so you could do your own homework and research on that. Aaron, if you could, we're going to open up the chat line. So Aaron, if you could share both the SEC link. So for anybody that hasn't read that, they can go to the SEC link, our blog link. And then the other thing we're offering is if you would like us to talk to you and your security team about compliance and kind of best practices that we've seen, we can put together a short 20, 30-minute session with you. So I guess maybe Aaron, if you could also add our blog post as well as the contact us page. So if anybody wants to take us up on that kind of free consultation, we're happy to talk to you about that. As I said before, welcome. Happy Tuesday, everybody. And today we're going to talk about navigating the new data breach rules. I'm Ken Gavranovic, COO of Blameless, joined by Jim Gochee, our CEO. Little quick background on myself. I've been doing software and engineering for a long time. Just to date myself, back when you would read a book. Can you believe it, Jim? To teach yourself how to code and do assembly and all those things. But I've been in the industry from the beginning of web hosting. I've done multiple FedRAMP certifications, worked with Jim at New Relic. I've been at Cox. So I've worked at very large organizations. I've worked at unicorns. I've worked at startups where we're building a business. So I've got that kind of broad view of that, and so happy to be here. And one of the things that excited me to join Blameless with Jim about a year or so ago was it's a big problem. Incident management, when things break, creating a safe space for team members to have a blameless atmosphere where they really have continuous improvement is something that helps software companies. It helps oil rigs. It's just a great practice. And so, Blameless really puts all those things together. But before we dig into that, Jim, maybe give everybody a little background on yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. So I'm Jim Gochee, CEO of the company. I am sort of a developer by trade and have spent, I don't know, something like maybe 18 years in SaaS in particular. And, SaaS has unique security challenges. And when I oversaw, product management and engineering at New Relic, I also oversaw the security team for a good part of the company's history. And so I have an appreciation of what goes into security. And here at Blameless, we sort of have two primary use cases for our incident management solution. One is in the security use case, and that's what we're talking about here today. And there's also a lot of overlap and commonality with sort of the site reliability use case, which we also we do. So it's fun to be here talking about security, and I don't know. I think it's quite interesting, kind of what the SEC is doing here. It's all in the spirit of making investors wiser, but really what that means is it's raised the bar on any company that's a public company, or even a company that's thinking about going public, and what is this going to mean for you and your security program. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think it also really goes well to transparency, because you think about it, like if you have an incident management program in your company and maybe certain business units don't follow it, it's inconsistent, then basically things happen in your enterprise, and oftentimes there's no continuous learning, because your stuff's going to happen, software's going to break, unfortunately some people are going to get compromised, but if the light shines on it, then I think you have that opportunity for continuous improvement. And that's why I think some of these rules and some of the new disclosures that is coming forth really make sure we're really focused on, how broad is this impact, what are we doing about it, and how are we getting better. So Jim, if you don't mind, maybe just dive in just a little bit, just give a quick high level overview from your perspective of the SEC's new
Yeah.
rules.
Yeah, so so the goal of what the SEC was trying to do here, and they've been working on this for many years, is just providing more transparency to investors. So the SEC is out to protect investors. A lot of the regulations that they have on companies is for investors. And what's been clear is a number of companies that have been experiencing cybersecurity attacks, or any kind of serious situation that would impact a company financially. That this is on the rise, and so the SEC has gotten to the point where they've determined that there just needs to be more transparency and more disclosure here, for the benefit of the investor. So to me, as I read the regulations, there's really three parts to them. The first part is the requirements around reporting an incident that has a potential material impact on the company, reporting it within a very short time period. And there's definitions of like what that's going to look like, and I think that you have to look at that closely, and you've got to figure out like, where are you going to draw the line, like in terms of how you define these things. Secondly, there is a requirement, periodic, I believe it's annual, to basically describe what your security policies, practices, procedures are. And I think this is the more interesting part to me, because everybody has something in place today. It's not like you don't have kind of a response plan and your process and policy in place. But now that you're going to have to sort of be very transparent about it, I think anybody who's maybe been a little bit lax, or maybe hasn't sort of done, say, like a best of breed policy, and best practices, like this is going to now be a little bit more transparent. And so it's going to raise the question of like, okay, well, what is like a really high quality program look like? And you're going to set your own rules of how you define that. But then you've got to ask yourself, like, are we following our own practices? Is it repeatable? Is it auditable? Like, how much support is in place to basically support your security practice? And that's where we come in. And then the final part of the rule, which is also quite interesting, is you have to disclose your board members' knowledge of cybersecurity. And I read the actual language in the ruling, and it's not that you're going to be like, you could be sued as a board member. Like let's say you're the board member with cybersecurity experience and there's a breach, like you're not personally on the hook for it. I mean, the entire board is on the hook as a fiduciary for the company and representative of the investors. But I think this is actually going to be quite good. So if you're sitting in a security department, you're sitting in a security group, there's just more pressure to have good awareness and support now, all the way for what you're doing, all the way up through the board, because all that's going to now be public, right? So think about a big company where there's nobody on the board with cybersecurity experience. That's going to look really bad for them. So again, it's going to encourage companies to lean in more, in how they choose board members and whatnot, to really make sure they've got some experience at the board level. So in general, I mean, if you're in security, like this is good for you in a public company. It's good for you because companies are just going to invest more, take it more seriously, and potentially it gives you actually future career opportunities, I think, for growth even.
Yeah, and where I think that For those of you that are in a public company, and again, this applies to large public companies in the US or small public companies. So if you're a large public company, we actually have RFPs working with clients right now that you have to actually be ready to go in December. So that's what the requirement ruling says. So if you're not aware of this and you need some help, again, please feel free to go to the contact page. We can get you up to speed on what we're seeing, what we're helping other clients with. But you've only got a 4-day window to file that with your 8K. So it's really, really important that not only do you have this, as Jim, you mentioned, the documentation, but you have to have the systems and process to have transparency across it. And it's a little bit harder these days than it used to be, because it used to, in the old days, you had the ops team, you had the software team would write software, they toss it over to the ops team would run that system. Most times that system was a monolith. It was either up or it was down, and you could very much easily firewall things off from the outside world. Well, in this new world, if you're a large company, you might have 80, 100, 90 teams working, in many cases, changing your software daily. You might have automated CI/CDs, you've got security checks in there, but you still need to have that transparency. You can't have it where one team's troubleshooting an incident, maybe it's a security issue or it's not, unbeknownst to the rest of the company. That just causes issues. So I think that's going to become really important for companies to make sure that they've instituted, that they really understand in their complex organization what's going on and how they have documentation of what's going on and everybody's aligned. So moving past that. So again, just for everybody, again, the rules, you can read it in the link, but it's 4 days if you're a big company, and you've got 180 days to comply if you're a public company in the US. So this is something all companies are going to have to do. So it's really important that you've got the tools, the systems put in place to do that. The next part, Jim, I thought might just jump into is a little bit, as what's a material cybersecurity incident? And I have some thoughts on that. I don't know if you want to, do you have your own little definition of it?
Yeah, I think, well, the SEC defines it as something that, could, materially affect a company's operations or financial condition. Obviously, this would not be most of the security incidents that you've probably run into. I remember back in the relic, I mean, we'd have security incidents fairly frequently, but they were of a low severity level, essentially not material. And we never had a single one that was essentially material to the company. And so I do think the bar is pretty high here. But I think what's more important is, as you do get bigger, you're going to be attacked more, and I think the possibility of something that's material does go up, and I think you have to be prepared for that. Obviously, so you're gonna probably have some sort of like, hey, anything that could delay an earnings report, or anything that if we announced it publicly could move the share price. Right, so there's like a litmus test you can do here. Those are the things that you do have to report very quickly. And it's kind of like, Ken, like this is true with anything material that a company could have happen. The SEC is just calling out security breaches here, but technically any material information, does need to be provided essentially to the public, because the public owns your company, right? So you can't sit on anything. But with security, I feel like, the industry has not really been forthcoming, and stuff leaks out, and then investors kind of get screwed. And I think the SEC is just saying like, look, these kinds of breaches sometimes are material and they're not being reported today, and they need to be reported today. So that's my personal take on what material is. I'm curious how you view it.
Well, and I'll kind of go, I think what the SEC said is, it's the nature and the scope of the incident, the potential impact on the company's financial condition, or operations, the likelihood of public disclosure, which again, I think really hits on some of the things you said, and then the company's actually past cybersecurity history. So if you have a lot of history of challenge, they're saying, hey, listen, we want disclosure. And I think this is where it becomes really important, not just with cybersecurity issues, but, Jim, a lot of times we have customers now talking about the data processing addendums. You've got GDPR, you've got CCPA, you've got a lot of different things. And so, security teams and when they're engaged and who's making the decision becomes very important. So I know, like, some of our financial customers, they have it. So if an issue happens and it's in this particular country, then they might want to automatically page in a security person that's understanding of those rules so that they can make that designation. And of course, prior to that security person arriving, they want to make sure that all that metadata is captured, which, again, works really well with some of the things that we do for clients. Let's go back into the next things, what companies have to include in disclosures, because this I think is, again, really important. And a lot of companies don't have this information readily available and have to do research exercises. And when you have to turn this into the SEC in an 8K filing in 4 days, you don't really have that time to do that kind of research exercise.
Well, that's a good point. Time is of the essence. There's probably a lot that's got to get done, and this is sort of one of the things that we help companies with is just facilitate more rapid, incident response, really from top to bottom. And so, speed is an issue. A lot of companies have a great incident response program, but there's a lot of toil in it, right? And it can take a long time to actually kind of run through it. So, in some days, 4 days is enough time, but in some days, 4 days is not. But in terms of what the SEC is telling companies that they need to report on, obviously a description of what happened and what the incident is, including the date and time of it, scope of the incident. So, what's potentially impacted, what's affected by it, how the company is impacted. I think this really gets to the materiality to the business. So obviously if there was a major breach of a system, but it had no impact on the company whatsoever, then obviously that's not really something that would need to be reported per se. But even a small breach in an area that, was potentially like a highly leveraged point within the company that could, maybe your internal networks were attacked and, and then you were kind of offline. Maybe you were a Wall Street trading firm and you couldn't trade for 2 business days or something. But what's the impact of the company? And then I think this is kind of the interesting part, the company's remediation efforts. So now you're gonna put yourself out there and be potentially sued. So I think this is where companies have to be very careful to not over-represent what they've done to remediate it. This is where, accuracy is going to really count. And this is where it could be embarrassing if your remediation efforts, are really not up to par. Then your legal team's going to have to make a determination, but you're probably better to put that out there as it is, pretty honestly, because the problem is if you misrepresent, then you really open yourself up to a much greater degree of risk in lawsuit than if you represent accurately, even if it's not a great story. But having an accurate, again, archived, accurate representation of what you did to remediate it. How quickly did you act? What steps were taken? Did people know what they were supposed to do? Right? So, now potentially the sort of start to finish of your incident response, now that potentially becomes public. And so, you want to make sure you're treating it appropriately internally and you have a high bar for what that response is going to look like and that you're actually following it. So you can't just have a great policy and it's not being followed. Like, it's the follow through that's going to get reported. And I think that's what's really interesting here.
Yeah, and we'll jump in a little bit about how we think, is a good best practice and, potentially how we might help you. I think, Jim, you kind of hit on the annual disclosure requirements. So maybe I'll just hit on it, again, in your annual 10K, if you're a public company, the company cybersecurity risk management process, the company cybersecurity strategy, the company cybersecurity governance structure are all things that they're expecting you to have in the 10K, which, again, this next part we'll talk about is how, we think tools like Blameless and really help companies do that. Anything else I missed, Jim, on the annual disclosures?
No, I mean, I think that's about it. Now, I think it's a great question, like how much detail do you want to go into? And I think, this is where potentially it becomes, a competitive differentiator. I think the companies that take this very seriously in the age of cybersecurity attacks are gonna, potentially score higher with investors. And you might also imagine, some, some funds, that, teachers pension in Minnesota. I mean, they may write rules that say, they have this level of bar that they're going to look at in terms of what they expect to see from any company that they're going to invest in, right? So you don't really know like exactly where the market's going. But again, more conservative investors, and there's a lot of them out there, that prop up stock price. More conservative investors could potentially have a higher bar for what they're looking for in the details here. So, at a high level, I mean, let's say you had a pretty weak, cybersecurity risk management process. Well, you could put that in your 10K. What you don't know is like, how does that impact the stock price? How does that damage it? And you could potentially be sued by existing investors who say, you guys, like, that's all you're doing, and now the stock price is dropping because these other more conservative funds have to pull their money out because you don't meet a minimum bar. So I think there's enough uncertainty there that, you're going to really want to think carefully about having a high quality process in place, high quality answer to, like, how you're thinking about it strategically, and then how you govern it to make sure that it's actually working as designed.
Makes sense. All right, so let's jump into, hopefully we wouldn't scare anybody, but these things are serious and really can be solved if you have, again, a repeatable process. So let's jump in a little bit, Blameless's role in compliance, and I'll share from my perspective. I think it's always good to kind of, let's frame the whole thing in this new world. We've deconstructed the monoliths. We have, again, dozens or hundreds of teams working on different parts of our systems. They're all intertwined, interconnected. We might have one authentication service instead of 10 like we used to have. A lot of that work's been done. And so then an incident or something happens, right? Something's not performing well. And if you don't have a consistent process, what might have is one team that's now self-contained is off troubleshooting it in Slack or Teams, maybe not informing the rest of the company. Then some other group has a impact, and they don't know that this team is actually working on it. So now you've got a cascading impact, and people aren't communicating. Then if you throw in security aspect to it, let's just take it first, data residency. Maybe there's some data that's being moved around that's EU-based data. So now you've got GDPR requirements, and that team's talking quietly. They don't know about GDPR requirements because they didn't know that that particular instance, let's just say, ran in the UK. And then if you want to go to more, and then they determine out that some of that PII data had a security breach. Now, if you have teams talking isolated, or in many cases, different teams have different processes around incident management. Hey, we're going to do it this way. This other business unit's going to do it this other way. This other business unit's going to do it this other way. Well, how can you really ensure that you're handling data residency requirements? You've got data processing addendums with your right vendors, that this is being reviewed. Is it a material breach? Is there PII data? Are we storing the data properly? And the way to solve that is a consistent workflow. Is you say to a team, hey, when you have an incident, the first thing is going to be, there's going to be communication. And that way the whole company can see that there's a thing going on here. And so when that second thing happens, there's visibility. You're going to document in the system and say, I want to remind everybody that if this happens, then they need to also page in a security person. They need to remind everybody, if this particular system has an issue and it's in the UK, then we need to have somebody review things from a data residency, or we need to store things from a different place. And then we need to go and communicate that to everybody so everybody's on the same page. We need to capture all that metadata. Post that, we need to have a continuous improvement. So going back to remediation, a lot of cybersecurity issues really are long neglected issues that people knew about, but there was no continuous learning. So post the incident getting resolved, you've got to go to, we call it RCA, root cause analysis. We understand what went wrong, whether it be it's data residency, whether it's a security issue. And then you need to make sure that people have action items. And then you need to have real-time dashboards that track, are those action items actually complete until they're resolved? And everybody needs to have access to data. And I think that to do all of that, that's where a system like Blameless, I think, really comes in handy for companies, because they can put a system and that they know that it's consistently being followed. Jim, I said a lot. What are some other thoughts maybe we might be able to help?
Yeah, well, I think what you did is you sort of iterated through what a high quality program looks like, where there's lots of communication between teams, and certainly things like follow through. I mean, imagine if you had a major breach and you discover it was a known issue from 4 years ago, and just no one was really people forgot to fix it or something, right? Which a lot of these, like you said, like a lot of these things were probably someone knew about them at some point. So, there's a level of professionalism that's now expected. Again, the bar is higher, and you kind of like you called out a lot of like what good really looks like. And then the challenge you have, of course, is like enforcing that process and making sure it's followed in a point where it can be reviewed and that there's documentation and it's auditable, but really just followed and facilitated, right? Because it's sometimes easy to finish something. Like there's a small security breach, you get through it, and you're just working on the next thing, and sort of like making sure the follow through happens sometimes gets dropped. So again, just enforcing that certain things are happening, and like you said, that's where a tool there's a tool. That's where a tool like Blameless can really help out. Is with that sort of facilitation, workflow, also a source of truth with respect to things like what's the retrospective, what was the analysis, and then follow up actions. And these are the follow up actions, and did they get fixed? And so again, you can put all that in place manually. There's just a lot to it, and tools that support that just make it a lot easier to implement with people executing it more reliably, right? So it's not just easier, but you're going to have more compliance if there's like structure in place and tools to kind of keep everybody on track.
Makes sense. And if somebody asks, like, what type of solution do we offer? I always go back to is what Blameless does. It really works with all your existing tools. So it puts that automated workflow, the complete thing from, communications to incident management to the metadata capture, whether it be in Slack or Teams or, web or whatever it is, the reporting, the RCA practice, really all of those things, but it connects with all of your existing systems. So if you use Ops Genie, if you use PagerDuty to call, it works with those. If you have status page, it works with that. If if maybe you've got ITIL practices and you're using, problem management and ServiceNow, it integrates with that. You're using Jira and you need to create, work items of who needs to fix this so you can track it. You can do all of that. So it really brings all of your tools that you already have, but puts that workflow around it specifically for automating incident management, which is a really expensive thing. I think that's, there's many estimates. I think it's probably $100 billion a year program that enterprises are really wasting money just in that inefficiency. And now that there's some real meat, and compliance, I think it's something that we're going to all have to pay attention to.
Well, you have just on that topic really quickly. I mean, you have like two major internal use cases that we see. One in the security team, security incidents, all that, and then the other was site reliability. And what I like is both groups, have been maturing over the last decade, and really upping their game in terms of professionalism, how they respond, and really, and again, if you look at like the response that a site reliability engineer goes through and a response that a security engineer goes through, there's a lot of commonalities, but there's a lot of fundamentals that those two groups have brought in, often learning from the industry, right? Like the FAA has had very much like a blameless learning process for decades and decades, right? So when an airplane crashes, They do a very thorough retrospective and understand like how exactly did this happen, and then they create follow-up actions as a result. Maybe it's changes to training of the pilots, or maybe it's changes to the airplanes themselves or the electronics or whatever. But like, all of that learning that, other industries have spent a lot more time focusing again on safety and just that stuff, I think in site reliability and in security, we're picking up a lot of these same things, which is really great to see.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're seeing companies start to use us for, software security, and even in some cases, other types of incidents that they think, need that continuous improvement practice. I was talking to somebody recently that worked with a lot of oil rigs, and it's the exact same thing as they have a continuous improvement process. Because, again, there it's physical safety, right? Safety of the rig, safety of the people, but creating, a blameless, culture so that people report incidents and there's actually learning. Let's hit on a couple more things. In the case of a breach, I think communication is important. I've got some thoughts. Any thoughts you have as kind of key things that someone should do? I think it's, transparency is probably one of them. Making sure that it's persona-based communications. If it's super technical and you're sending it to an executive, make sure that they can absorb the information. And anything else that you think might be important, Jim?
Well, just on the communications topic for a minute, effective communications is critical as you're working the incident. Getting like, you sort of use an example earlier on this on this webinar where you're like, something happens in one team and it's affecting other teams. And so really like making sure like who needs to be in the loop whenever there's a problem, and making sure those communications are, high quality and they're high frequency. So rapid high quality communications will help you get through an incident faster. And making sure you've got all the relevant stakeholders identified. So in the context of security, who needs to be notified when, at what times, at what levels of importance. I can tell you as, being in a leadership position that, you never want to be the last person to find out about a security breach. You want to be like one of the earlier people to find out. So obviously it's reported, someone's looking at it, and then it sort of gets communicated out from there. So I just can't really stress enough the importance of communication. In terms of getting through, the early stage of an incident, understanding what it is, and then you've got to figure out like what actions you're going to take, and ultimately you're going to have to figure out, does this deserve being reported in an AK? So I think there's just a lot to do with communication, and just I think a lot of companies don't really think about that part of the process as much, and I would encourage you to have a really solid communications plan in place, and make sure that you can execute it. Make sure you can implement it, whether that's periodic testing, at the very least tabletopping, making sure you run, mock major breaches to sort of make sure you have all your ducks in a row of what it's going to take, all the way to, putting out a fake 8K. See if you can do that, right? So you can even just tabletop that to make sure you've got all the things in place that you would need to get to that point where the 8K goes out.
Makes sense. So on the communications, proactive, transparent. Jim, any final thoughts? And if we don't have any questions, we'll probably wrap early. This will be on, if you go to our website, you can scroll down the bottom. Maybe Aaron, if you could add the link in here, but if you're watching this, you're probably already on our security page, but if you go to the bottom of the footer, you can click on security. There's a lot more details around this type of information. But Jim, anything else that you think we missed?
I'll end where we started, which is companies should be doing this all along. If you're a really, really well-run company, you probably don't have to do a whole lot different except the final reporting step. But the truth is this is really a call to action. The SEC is forcing everybody's hand, and they're forcing a level of transparency, which is going to make companies look at the quality of their security program. Basically, it's not, everyone's got some program. It's not that no one has a security program. Everybody does. but the quality of it is going to be under review. You know, because it's now going to be public and transparent if you're a public company. So it's really like it's forcing everybody's hand, and I think for the better. And I think this is actually good news if you're in a security team. The good news for you is now you've got support and visibility all the way to the board potentially, and that's the new bar and the expectation. If you're a public company, you should have people on your board that are even familiar with cybersecurity. And that just means, like, you know, levels of investment in what you're doing. You know, people sort of taking stuff very seriously. I can tell you, you know, having been through an IPO, that everyone has to do the annual security training, and sometimes there's the laggards who won't do the annual security training. And you know, now you can bet all the way to the CEO that there's strong support to make sure that, you know, your company is fully compliant with all the programs that you have. And then, you know, where that comes into play with us, like, there's great tools in the security realm already, but you know, what we bring to the table around incident response and just helping to facilitate that workflow, we do have a number of companies who use us just for security, and they really find it beneficial, you know, to have a tool that really assists with that workflow, data tracking, and communications. Those are the areas that the existing security tools don't really do much for. But that whole part of it, you know, like how effective is your response, how effective is your analysis, and how effective is your follow through on follow up work, that's often what's missing, and that's what we bring to the table.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think effective and then consistent, because that's the other part is companies often, you know, unless you have a system doing it, you'll usually be inconsistent in time. So great. It looks like we don't have any questions, so we'll wrap in just a second. But I just want to remind everybody is if you're a large company, you've got to start complying with this 4-day rule in December. If you're not considered a large enterprise, and again, you can take a look at the SEC site and what that means, then you've got 180 days, but then you also have to comply with that 4-day rule after 180 days. If there's anything we could do, we don't have to sell you anything. If you just like to talk to us, see if we can share what other people are doing, you just go to blameless.com/contact, and we're happy to spend 30 minutes with you. That's all I have, Jim. Anything else?
No, that's it. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Have a great Tuesday, everyone.